Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the youHQ Wellbeing Wins webinar series with me, Jez, Engagement Director at youHQ, and I am really excited. Genuine, I know people always say that, and I've said that, but this is one I'm really looking forward to, talking to Chris Wright, Head of Wellbeing at Youth Sports Trust. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today.
Jez, absolute pleasure. I'm really looking forward to it.
We have got a lot that I know that you want to talk about, that I want to talk about. Firstly, though, Chris, for anyone that doesn't know you and the work you do at the Youth Sports Trust, can you give us a quick intro into you and your background and the work that you're doing?
Sure. Chris Wright, I'm Head of Health and Wellbeing. I've been at children's charity Youth Sports Trust for the last 20 years. So quite a bit of time working both in the PE and school sports sector, more recently in the health and wellbeing sector and its relationship with education. The Youth Sports Trust is an amazing charity, although you'd expect me to say that. We're based out of Loughborough University and work both across the UK and internationally, and pretty much focus, Jez, on how we can use the power of PE and sport to change children's lives in education and hopefully address some of the inequalities that they face right the way from early childhood, so we go all the way from birth through to 24 years old.
You're right, Chris. It is a brilliant charity, and I'll be honest, when I was working definitely towards the back end of my career in the independent sector, I would say possibly a charity that wasn't so aware of the work you were doing, probably because I was in the independent sector, but definitely since I've been working on youHQ, I've really noticed the amount of work that the Youth Sports Trust is doing in that health and wellbeing space, which is something that I really want to get into with you, about talking about the physical and the movement side and how it links back to the mental side. And I know that's something you're super passionate about. Where does your passion for this subject come from? You go a little bit further back to your background, maybe in sport, or what inspires you to do this work?
Yeah, so initially, Jez, if I'm honest, it was mainly on the talent side, and it was because I believe that I was part of a generation of young people that weren't able to realise their talent. I was really fortunate to be supported by my school at the time in Kettering, and by my parents to be quite successful in terms of my performance as a squash player and then as a football player. But I was in a generation of young people who were not in the system as such. You know, in those days, you didn't have sort of academization, and you didn't have those support network, those talent pathways and those support networks around you to realize your potential. And many of my friends and those who were brilliant athletes never made it successfully at the top of their sport. So I got into sort of talent identification and sort of trying to understand how young players develop and how they might thrive and become the best versions of themselves. But then I suppose my mindset really switched when I got my first job in sports development, and it was in a little charity now called the Coventry Sports Foundation, but it was the Centre 87 charity that was founded by David Moorcroft. And I got involved in a program called Physical Education for Primary Schools. And it was literally taking the most vulnerable children in the city from their schools who didn't have the facilities or the people to give them a positive experience of PE and bus them into the leisure centre, which is where we operated. And these are children who came in without any PE kit, often hungry, cold, maybe in communities where they're experiencing high levels of crime and deprivation, and certainly from a family perspective might not have had the best upbringing, and just saw instantly a completely different child in front of you as soon as they engaged in something positive, meaningful, active, fun, and enjoyable. And I believe that program's still going today. This was back in 1996, and that really switched on in me a passion for how we can use this wonderful subject of physical education, but also the context and values of sport to change children's lives.
So good. Yeah, really good. And just again, hearing you saying those things makes me remember, you know, how important it was for me as a PE teacher. And I think looking back, I wouldn't say I fell into it, but I think when I first started teaching PE, I never went into it thinking about how powerful it was on the things that you just said around how it can really change lives. It was really more about just the fact that I liked sport, and I played quite a good level of sport. And yeah, that's something we can come on to in a bit. What about the Welsh schools initiative. Would you call it an initiative? I don't want to get the wrong term, because it's a community of schools you're really building, and is that something? Can you tell us a bit more about that and when it started and how that's growing and what the plans are with that? 'Cause I'm really interested in that side of things as well.
Yeah, so I suppose just a bit of a backstory, Jez, which I hope hopefully is helpful for listeners, is when I first joined the Youth Sport Trust in 2003, it was off the back of an announcement from the government that we would have a national strategy for PE in school sport. It was announced by Tony Blair, and we've sort of come to that point where it was really positive, and we had specialist sports colleges, and we had networks of school sport partnerships, and we had a huge infrastructure of amazing people, professionals that were driving not just the subject, but the impact of that subject on children's health, happiness, and learning. Through the 2000s, and then almost to the point of probably about 2018, 2019, we've come full circle to children being really vulnerable, huge amounts of physical, social, and emotional needs. And it was at that point where we realized that we had to do something different. So the Well School movement, as we called it then, I suppose it's more of a concept now than anything else, was launched in December 2019 to answer all of the challenges that we're facing, not just in education, but in society. But based on all of that amazing work that 500 schools did under the banner of specialist sports colleges, that really put the health and well-being of pupils at the centre of everything that they do. And I can describe, I suppose, in great detail what that looks like, Jez, but it is just a group of schools that feel that there needs to be a different way. There needs to be a way of addressing the significant barriers that children have to learning. Often for us, we recognise that that's in the physical domain. If we don't get children's physical development and physical health right, we don't get effective learning. But more so for us as a charity is, what's the impact on their life chances? What happens throughout their school careers, but also what happens when they leave? What are we preparing them for in a digital world and in a chaotic sometimes and often traumatic world and society in which they are going to grow up in? And how does it equip them with the things they need for employment? We've got quite a narrow scope of what is success in education, and quite a narrow curriculum now, and a narrow set of accountability measures. But Well Schools is trying to answer some of those problems and galvanise an education sector, which I think feels now they need to do something different than what they have been.
So it was September 2019 when it was relaunched, or that's when it really started. And since then, have you seen, with everything that's happened since then, in a more of a need for this type of concept because of everything that's happened, like the pandemic and everything that's going on in the world? Have you really noticed that difference? Are you getting that feedback from the schools you're working with, and therefore do you see an increased need for this concept to be really pushed through schools?
Yeah, so and you've worked in schools, Jez, and you've probably had a million phone calls from organisations and from offers of support that help you intervene with groups of children. So I suppose a long-winded way of saying the impact of Well Schools has been a change of the conversation, but an understand that we need to do something differently about the system within which we operate. So we can keep having programs around mental health support teams and education practitioners with a focus on children's educational needs, but also their emotional social well-being. We have programs and interventions that work on children's mental health and also on their sort of their life skills and their leadership. But Well Schools is a bit bigger than that. It's more how do we change the system? How do we operate in the system, but in a different way that changes the system for others, and maybe potentially changes the system for the future? And I think that's the need, is that schools are so overwhelmed with all of the problems that are landing on their gates in the morning that we need to think differently, but consistently and over time. So there's no short fixes to this. So Well Schools isn't really, Jez, if I'm honest, anything new. It's not rocket science. It's taking the best evidence and some of the best principles and frameworks from across various parts of the education, health and sports sector, and helping schools make sense of that, and then making sure that we offer up solutions, tools and resources that are easily accessible and can help them then make that step into changing the culture potentially, and then certainly looking after the health and happiness of their staff and pupils.
So essentially any state-funded school, primary or secondary, that believes in this concept can go to Well School's website, sign up for free, and then they get that support network within that community, those resources, that framework, those ideas, sharing opportunities, I suppose. And that's the idea, that it brings those people together who are like-minded, but it doesn't necessarily mean everyone's got to do it in the same way. It can be done in various different ways. And I think the thing that you're saying that I find interesting, but also really difficult for schools, is they have to work within the confines of the curriculum and what they have to deliver in order to be compliant and tick Ofsted's boxes. But they also, I suppose, have to be relatively bold and sort of progressive in a way to be able to use the advice and the support that you're giving them through the Well Schools network to create that environment where students get the opportunity to move their bodies and embrace health and well-being in a slightly different way, which, you say out loud, it's quite challenging, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. We talk about courageous leadership, Jez, but what we always say that we'll do is we'll guide people and we'll hold their hand along the way, and maybe break down some of those myths. I know that when we were sharing the promotion for this session, that we said we were going to try and tackle some myths. I think the problem is that we've got this sort of almost frivolous statement of health and well-being, and we think that it's something that we do on the side.
Yeah.
But when we can get schools to realize that it is the work, it's central to everything that we do, really, then it sort of makes sense. You can't have an unwell, disenfranchised, unhappy member of staff in a school trying to be the best teacher that they can be on that given day and expect children to learn and to thrive. Equally, you can't expect a child who's coming into your school to sit down in front of your class teacher with any sort of development gaps, without any additional with additional emotional, sometimes educational needs, to be effective learners. So it's really, really simple. If you get the basics in place around children's development and their physical, social, mental health, then you get a well school, and you can build a culture which means that everybody feels supported in that, and everybody can make those steps forward. The most important thing, Jez, in all of this is keeping it really, really simple, and not making it tokenistic. So making sure that we're doing things, as you point out, they're systematic, straightforward, impactful, but also they're realistic within the confines of what a school can control.
Do you get schools that come back to you, Chris, and say, with the best will in the world, we're really struggling here. Like we want to do this, but we're just not quite sure. Like you said, because we get this with youHQ, and that term health and wellbeing. You're right. It's almost become, it's used so much now, isn't it? That I think there's probably a bit of fatigue with it, maybe, and I don't know whether you find that as well. So is that the pushback sometimes, that they say, well, really, we are judged on by Ofsted mainly. Yes, obviously within Ofsted and the independent schools framework, they're putting wellbeing and personal development in the language. But I think, are you finding that often schools are saying that's the first thing we have to get right, or that's the thing that we're being told we have to get right, but now you're saying it's more the health and wellbeing? And that we know that we all know, really, if we all stop and think, whether we're teachers or working wherever we're working, that if people aren't feeling good, if they're not happy and well and valued, because ultimately that's why I left the profession. And that's something, I want to talk to you about in a bit. And that's something that's on your video. Is, I think the stat was something like 80% of teachers currently are at least thinking of leaving the profession. So is that the kind of dialogue that you're having with these schools? And then you obviously, then that's the work that you have to do with them.
Yeah, it's showing them two very distinct things, Jez. One is it's a means to an end. So this is absolutely about helping them to reach, or certainly work towards, the accountability measures within which schools are governed. So it's not about moving away from the day job. There's no part, no one in the Youth Sport Trust is going to stand up and say we don't care about children, achieving good standards in reading and writing and arithmetic. They are fundamental skills and suites of knowledge that they absolutely have to have. But the way in which you get them to do that has to be through children's bodies, not just through their minds. There was amazing, and I don't know where the research came from, but they did this whole piece of research with people that worked in the financial districts in London, and it was all around burnout and the fact that many of the hedge fund managers and financiers that were working in the city were blowing up physically. They were destroyed, and they were breaking down and leaving the profession in the same way that we do with our teaching profession, because they were just wiped out. And what they realized was that they hadn't focused on the bodies, they were just focused on the heads. And they thought that the bodies were just vessels to carry these big heads around so that they could, use their minds and make more money. And ultimately, that's what we're doing with our kids, and what we're doing with our staff is we're just seeing the body as inconsequential to the rest of the being. So that's the first and most important thing, is it's a means to an end. The second is, this hasn't been written by myself or my colleagues in a darkened room or any of the partners that are with us. It's been written by schools for schools. So if you look across our board, and there's people like Ben Levinson at Kensington and Claire Hoods-Truman at Oasis Blakenhale, one of the most deprived parts of Birmingham, they've turned schools around on this. They've gone from RI to good over time, 4 or 5 years. You talk to Claire Hoods-Truman, the kids were throwing chairs at each other when she walked in on the first day. And one of my favourite stories is going down the corridors of the school when I first met her, and there's all of the children's work all the way down the side of the corridor on the way to the sports hall. And I was like, oh, you must be, really happy with with the standard of writing. And I assumed that it was year 6. I said, getting ready for the SATs and year 6 handwriting. I said, no, that's year 2. And it was off the charts, Jez, brilliant. Some of it was almost like calligraphy. It was just stunning. So that whole sort of thing, and I know we're big fans of John Ratey, the whole thing around the physical, brain synapses, cognition, concentration, crossing the midline, all of the things that we talk about as PE professionals is fundamental to this. If we don't get the basics right, and schools can't show what it looks like, then we're up against it.
Chris, I love hearing those stories, like you said, like schools going from requiring improvement and putting something probably the reality is it probably is quite overwhelming to start with, isn't it? To think I've got to do something different. But once it's in place, this sort of stuff, it's not actually rocket science, is it? It's simple things. And can you give good examples of those sorts of schools? I know you can't give everything, but can you give an example? If let's say there's teachers and senior leaders out there that are listening to this and going, look, this is so inspiring, and I'd want to get involved, or at least want to read a bit more, find a bit more about these stories. Like, can you tell us where to find those stories potentially, and also maybe just a really good example that stands out of a simple thing that was put in place in one of these schools that really had that impact?
Yeah, so if people go to the website and click on the Join Us button, they'll be able to access all of the guides. And the most important guide there is the Steps to Success, Jez. When we went to the founding schools, we had about 30 across the UK, we asked them one simple question, and this was with the University of Manchester, who were doing the research project, is what works? Within the gift of a school, within the gift of the formal and informal curriculum, what works for you? And they came up with a structure, essentially 3 pillars that answered 3 problems. The first pillar was well led, and it was everything to do with staff wellbeing and retention. Tangibly, what are the things that we can put in place as a school that means that we're developing staff, we're looking after their mental and their physical health, we're looking at things like their workload, how we provide more flexible working relationships, how we ensure that they are valued through things like health cash plans or occupational therapy, those things that actually we take for granted, I think, sometimes, certainly in our organisation.
And is that data gathered initially on staff? Do they survey them and find out a bit more about what they think they want? Is there a standard, or is that up to the school to come up with that for themselves?
There's some great suites of resources in there, Jez, about staff voice and about staff surveys, but you can find out everything that you need to know about the problems, and actually we probably know the problems. So Sophie put up this, the piece on Teacher Wellbeing Index just there. Is how you then react to that. Because the problem I think we've got is that it becomes a bit tokenistic, and one of our board members, I won't quote the person, but he says, it's all very well putting the Kit Kat in the pigeonhole and saying you can have some croissants on a Friday morning, but then if you go down, do a lesson observation, tell them that they're rubbish, and you haven't achieved anything. So there's a well-led pillar. The second is well-prepared, which is everything to do with physical and mental health. And then the well-equipped pillar is everything to do with how we, introduce and develop human skills and those things that children will need in a digital age and for employment. So go there, steps to success, choose those things under those pillars that you want to take action on. And in our world, it's about, so what does your high quality physical education experience look like? What's the movement culture you're creating around your school? How are you taking care of children's access to good food when they're with you, and good sleep, and looking after their mental health, maybe with aspects of psychotherapeutic support or pastoral support, whatever it may be. So when you put these jigsaws together, you end up sort of developing momentum and seeing real change both in the pupils, but also then in the culture and in the staff. And again, I go back to Claire. So when Claire walked into ACES Blakenhall, and she's now taken over the infant school, she said that, well, they were balmy. The kids were just feral. They're and I think that's a big problem, is they're just unregulated. They weren't physically developed, so they weren't socially developed, and they weren't emotionally developed. And therefore, the first thing she thought about was, so how do I just get them to behave and focus on the things that we want to focus on? And she's carried this through now 6-7 years later. If you go in on any given morning, 8:30, you'll see a whole year group doing HIIT classes. They're all strapped up with the heart rate monitors. And most uniquely for Claire is you'll also find the parents doing it, and you'll also find the staff doing it alongside. And they've just developed this culture of, we're going to move together and then we'll be able to learn together. And this whole mantra of essentially happy, healthy learners is all the way through the school. And that's a school that was sort of bottom 5% for Progress for Progress, now top 5%. That's in 6 years. So as long as schools understand you need to do it consistently well and over time, then they'll find lots of support and lots of examples about how people have made that happen.
And just to be clear on it, Chris, we're not necessarily saying you've got to do loads more PE. That's not what we're saying. I know I'm a former PE teacher. I know that's your world and what you love, and you love sport. It's not just physical activity, sport and movement, is it? It's all the other things around it. Like you said, it's diet and nutrition, it's sleep, it's all those different pillars of health and well-being. So that's the Well Schools Network is not just do more PE, do HIIT classes, even though that's a brilliant idea and I love it. And again, we can talk a bit more about the sort of things that I remember I did when I was teaching PE that worked well. It's the whole picture, isn't it?
Yeah. So we've never been able to stand there and say, because sports colleges were the fastest improving schools for 4 years, it was all down to PE and sport. There was lots of other things that were going on around that. So if you look through the steps of success, you'll see. So how are you using things like your trips and school visits? How are you, how are you using your leadership programs? How are you using your RSE curriculum? How are you considering how you put good food in the canteens? But it's those simple things as well about the physical environment. So do you take care of the spaces around you? Are they good places to learn? Do you get the kids outdoors? There's one of our podcasts that we've ran. There's a great guest called Dr. William Bird that some of your listeners might have heard of, but he actually describes the ultimate human condition is when we're outside, when we're active, when we're with others, but also when we're hungry. We haven't really evolved since Neanderthal days. So therefore, why are we expecting children to come in and learn and be happy and well if we're preventing all of those basic needs being met. So yeah, it's no one size fits all. It's not prescriptive. It genuinely is a movement. It's lots of schools and lots of agencies coming together to do the right thing.
Can we go back to the teacher retention idea? And is that something, again, that you've seen is more of a problem over the last few years? I left the profession a year and a half to 2 years ago. And maybe it's just my awareness and the fact that I'm going to different events and talking about the things that we talk about. But it feels like I've noticed more of a narrative around teachers that don't want to teach anymore. Is that something you've seen grow in the work that you've been doing over the last couple of years? And if so, do you have any thoughts on why that is?
Yeah, so we have our own statistics around physical education. We've lost 2,500 PE teachers since 2012, closing in on 45,000 hours of secondary physical education. And year on year, we see teachers right the way across the board leaving the profession because of stress, anxiety, frustration, and some of them are not even going on to other things. They just can't take anymore. And my biggest concern with all of this, Jez, is I don't really have a view, if I'm honest. I haven't been a head teacher, I haven't been a politician, I haven't been a civil servant or a policy maker in that sense. I haven't got a view on what is right for the future of education. What I do know is that the current system is reducing teachers' why. Why did you become a PE teacher? Why did you leave the profession? Whenever we have this conversation in our sector with physical education teachers, or indeed even those sort of senior leaders and head teachers, is they're losing their why. The reason why they got into education in the first place and wanted to become a teacher, let alone whether it was PE or math, science, English, they're just losing a bit of hope and a sense of purpose as to why they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it is to do with the fact that we are very rapidly moving away from how children develop, how they learn, that sense of creativity, their sense of hope and purpose and ambitions for the future. And we're sort of turning them into robots to a degree. And therefore we're asking teachers to teach to rule, and impart that knowledge on a 30-year-old robots in front of them. So I can understand why they're leaving. I'm just hoping that Well Schools can be part of the solution to maybe fixing that problem.
So again, it's so good that what the effort that you're making to do this. And again, listening to you say that, I was thinking about my why. Why did I start PE teaching? And again, like so many PE teachers, I imagine it's because they're passionate about inspiring young people to be physically active, because we know how important that's been for our own lives and our own development as people. And that's why I started doing it. I think I left because, like you said, and I think lots of people, when they become heads of department or they get into leadership, they're not doing those things that they loved doing when they first started teaching, which is on sports fields and sports courts and watching kids really enjoy being active. I just found it increasingly difficult to put my own individual creative stamp on the work I was doing, because I, again, was within the confines of the school and the system that I had to be in. And I was in the independent sector at the end, and it was slightly different. We did have a little bit of creative license, and we were able to play around with the PE curriculum enough, and I enjoyed that. But it still very much felt like you were saying we had to hit certain things, and therefore students had to do certain things. And yeah, it just felt like there wasn't enough creative license, and we weren't able to celebrate the uniqueness of the children as much as I wanted to. Now, doing the work I do now, I'm working with youHQ, and we've developed a very specific digital product, but I do a bit of personal training with adults, and I also coach my son's under-11 rugby team. That's really brought me back my why, because no one's breathing down my neck on those things. I still have to obviously do the safeguarding in the rugby club, but really we're allowed to just celebrate adults in the PT, I've got groups, celebrate them being physically active together. Like you said, they're doing the same things, they're active together, they're a mini community. And the same at the rugby club. And that's really given me back my why. And I just feel like that it's a bit of a shame that, and of course it's not as simple as just being able to do whatever you want, but it sounds to me like the Well Schools concept is empowering schools and staff with that ability to be able to think carefully about their why, and again impart that on the children. Obviously the results speak for themselves, which is great.
Yeah, you sort of hit the nail on the head as to, you know, if we're genuinely going to see any change in the current education system, then we need more people like you not to leave and rediscover their why. So if I there are several head teachers that I work with now, Jez, some, and I'm sure she won't mind me talking about, but Sue Watmo, Manchester Communications Academy, ex-head of physical education. She was a director of sport at Wright Robinson in Manchester, and has ended up at MCA, now principal. She just exudes why, you know, and she's so passionate about Well Schools because it's helping her, but also her team reconnect with the power of the subject and what it can do for the children who are in some of the most deprived parts of Moss Side. You know, their mantra as a school is, how do we help every child overcome social disadvantage? And she knows the magic bullet for her kids, for her staff, and for her school is her head of physical education, Sarah Wilcott, her team through people like Joe Neild. You know, they're just doing some incredible stuff. But you know what? Results are going up. It's, you know, it's not rocket science. They're taking care of the basic needs of these children, and developing, you know, well-rounded, healthy citizens of the future in really difficult circumstances. And I think you've also just hit on another sort of really important point, is why are we not celebrating what kids learn in core physical education? And how much time, you know, if we assume that every child's getting 2 hours of physical education a week, and it's non-examination PE, then why are we celebrating that? You know, there's so much good that's done in those 2 hours that's developing children socially, emotionally, physically, cognitively. You know, there's so much to be learned, I think, from what we did with those sports colleges all that time ago, and really bringing back to the forefront people like yourself, you know, rediscovering your why and driving some of that change that we need to see in schools.
Chris, can I pick up on something that you've just made me think of, which I'm sure will resonate with PE teachers, definitely secondary PE teachers, who are listening either live or will listen. One of the things that happened to me a lot, and happens, I'm sure, all the time in secondary schools, is students getting pulled from PE because they need academic support, or they need to meet a teacher, or whatever it is. They've got something on, and often whoever it is will look at the timetable and they'll go, well, they can come out of PE. Now, that kind of is part of what you're just saying. Why are we not celebrating what goes on in PE? Do you think, how do we change that, Chris? Like, how do we capture all the brilliance that is going on in these sessions? Because it's quite hard to capture that, isn't it? It's quite hard.
Yeah.
We're in a modern world where we have to evidence everything, which sort of, again, that's another reason why I think I got annoyed with teaching, because I just wanted to, why can't we just celebrate it? Why do I have to have a survey or data, or, you know, something written down on a piece of paper to prove the great work that, you know, I was doing with my department? How do we change that? Because that, it is the way it is, isn't it? Because core PE is, there's no exam, and teachers aren't under pressure to get kids a certain level of fitness or a certain level of happiness through PE or whatever it is. So yeah, I'm just wondering whether you've got any thoughts on that side of things, because that's the tale as old as time. I imagine that sort of story's been going on for many years, where kids get pulled from PE or that sort of lesson.
Yeah, it's I suppose for us as an organisation, I'm sure it is for many in the sector, it's our biggest frustration, because the evidence that supports movement and learning is empirical. It's, you know, it's written in the dawn of time. There's no child that has been able to sit down and do more academic work, and then some more academic work, and been better at academic work, unless children have that outlet, very basic outlet to move. You know, and you've been involved in performance sport. your circadian rhythm is all over the place. And I'll use my son as an example. I'm sure you will with yours. Is, you know, he used to be quite slow with his handwriting at primary school, and he got told that he would have to spend his break time doing more handwriting because he wasn't concentrating in class. The problem wasn't the fact that he was poor at handwriting, it was the fact that he wasn't able to concentrate and apply himself in the lesson because he had all of this. You know, he was a 7-year-old boy. He was, you know, fidgeting and looking out the window and wanting to move and getting up and sitting down, and therefore it was totally at the detriment of the outcome that they were looking for. So there's the basic stuff about, well, just go and observe the kids. You know, if they're not moving, then they're certainly not going to be doing the things that you want them to do. But there's also maybe a better job that we as a sector need to do around, you know, demonstrating the evidence or showing the evidence and making sure that those senior leaders and those politicians and those policymakers understand the importance of it. I have to say, go on, sorry, Jez.
No, sorry, Chris. I was just thinking, there's probably lots of places to go. Is there go-to places to prove? Is there stats? Is there evidence where people can just go onto websites and look? And you know, you mentioned some schools that have the evidence would be they joined the Welsh Schools Network and then they went from requiring improvement to good, outstanding, whatever it was. Is there more data? Is there available data that people can go out and find and see for themselves?
Yeah, so if in the evidence section of the website, you'll find the report from the University of Manchester. Believe it or not, it's the two headline statements are: if you're in a Welsh school, then you will find teachers are happy, supported, and with greater agency, and children are happy, healthy, and more effective learners. And there's a suite of 10 case studies from schools, one in Wales, and then mixture of context, primary, secondary, and special from across the country that have demonstrated what it looks like. But I suppose my Bible for all of this, Jez, is actually an old Public Health England document called Health, Wellbeing and Attainment. Goes back to 2016. And colleagues will be able to find that in the government archives. And essentially, it clearly demonstrates the effect of looking after children's health, well-being, and its impact on attainment. And given that it's only 2016, it's in the current sort of policy of the day, current system of the day. And right at the heart of that is a sports college example from Bacon's College down in Southwark, which did exactly everything we're talking about, is created a movement culture, looked after children's physical, social, and mental health, made sure that there was a huge variety and access to after-school sport, huge range of competitions and opportunities to play in teams. But the bit that you mentioned to me right at the start, Jez, is it was just a place where kids could play. You know, there was outdoor table tennis tables, there was little zones in the playground where they could take part in different activities, some of it social, good food, hydration, you know, water bottles on the desk. It's just, I'd just love us to get back to that, because that's where kids thrive.
Again, we'll have to do another one of these, because we could do a whole one on play, couldn't we? Because I love play, and you know, I'm a massive fan of parkour. And there's a great chap called Dan Edwards who's got a team of guys at Parkour Generations. I don't know whether you've ever been, but they've got this big push to try and they were doing parkour for schools, and I think they still do. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it, because what I found with that, people thought I was crazy. I remember people thought, what are you talking about, parkour? Because obviously, like, especially independent sector, it's team sports, and it's you know, it's your football, netball, hockey, rugby. But those kids and my 11-year-old who's upstairs, he really struggles academically, he struggles socially, emotionally, he struggles in every way possible. He is super physical. He has to move all the time, but he does not want to play competitive sport. It freaks him out. He's got some additional needs. But you put him on a scooter or a skateboard at a skate park, it's unbelievable. He's on a farm because of his need. He cannot sit in a classroom. He can't do it. He can't learn. He's so dysregulated. You used that term earlier. And his school, they're an amazing school. And I'll name them. They're called Beach Lodge and Maidenhead. They're fantastic. And they've created this alternative curriculum for him. He's working on a farm. He's learning about livestock, and he's learning through really genuine experiential learning. And honestly, I've seen such a change in him. And now he's ready to learn, because he wasn't ready to learn before. He was dysregulated, but now he's got the confidence through movement. And I'm not talking again about him playing 11-side football. I'm talking about him being on a farm and shifting hay bales and building and socializing through the movement that he's done. And they've taken him to the golf range. He outdrives me on the golf range. It's unfair. It's ridiculous. So the CEO listening to this will go, well, anyone can outdrive you on a golf range. But yeah, again, it's, and I know I'm biased, but I've seen it with both my boys. I've seen it, and my youngest son is team sport. He does play the team sport, and without his team sports, he would really struggle. So yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? We'll try and get back on track, because I was thinking about
not at all. I think that's the problem, though, isn't it, Jez? Is that we talk about this in different terms when really it's all the same. If you go over and work with Nike in the United States, and my colleagues have been fortunate enough to get over there last year. I wasn't invited, unfortunately, but they talk about play holistically. You play sports, you play out in the street, you play in the playground, you play with your friends. It's all play. And I'm fortunate enough to spend a little bit of time with Eugene Minogue, who used to be the CEO at Parkour UK, who's now CEO at Play England. And just talking to him at our manifesto launch a couple of weeks ago, and he said, we've just got to get back down to basics. And a great example of that is last week I was with Infinity Multi Academy Trust in Lincolnshire, and we were talking about play in the playground. So what's it look like? And they're saying, well, all we've managed to do is we managed to take away time from lunch times, so they're shorter. We have taken away the balls because of kids getting hit in the head. We've taken away our playground leaders, and we've taken away risky play, all to improve behaviour. But behaviour's just got worse. So they just went away and went, we're just going to go back to basics. We're just going to go back and let kids go and run around and play safely, hopefully. But that, just let children explore their bodies, so that we can then bring them back into the classroom and explore their minds.
It's funny you mentioned Eugene Minogue, because I did one of their parkour qualifications as a teacher, so I could deliver parkour, and I failed one of the physiology exams quite embarrassingly. Bearing in mind, I think I was teaching A-level Anat and Phys as well, so I had to go in and redo the paper. And I remember him looking at me going, "Aren't you a PE teacher?" I went, "Yeah, I am actually." Yeah, great stuff. I'd love, again, I think that's a whole play is a huge realm, and there's, I've started following more people on LinkedIn who are talking about play, and it's really inspiring stuff. And funnily enough, I talked to some of the adults that I train, and I try and get them to think less about always doing reps and sets and squats and single plane movements, which is what the parkour stuff is, and just go and explore. Because as an adult, you forget, you think you've got to go and do 3 sets of 10 all the time, bicep curls or whatever you're doing, but actually all you're really doing is restricting your movement, and you're actually reducing your longevity. So yeah, that's really interesting. So we're coming towards the last sort of bit now.
Yeah,
Sorry,
sure. Another little bugbear of mine is we talk about play in the early years. So my passion, my current passion, is the early years work that we're doing. And you talked about unregulated children. I do believe that, was it 1.7 million children are persistently absent from school at the moment? I do think it's a big problem with a lack of regulation with children not coming in. They're not coming into school into reception fully developed physically, certainly, but also socially, emotionally. But why do we then stop playing? Why do we stop playing pretty much from the end of primary school, and it becomes this taboo thing? As adults, why do we stop playing? Because
I think adults, there was a really good post, and I need to remember, I think her name's Jill Erskine, and she said adults feel weird playing, which I thought was quite interesting, don't they? Because you don't want to go in the playground and start doing the monkey bars where all the kids are doing it. But I actually remember in Wokingham doing that with my boys and doing a bit of parkour and chasing them around. And I remember a mum was like, "What's he doing? Why is he on the play?"
There's a great YouTube channel called Never Leave the Playground, and I hope he's still alive. But when I first came across it, there was a guy of about 72 over in the States, and he was still on his longboard, and he would go to the playground and do the monkey bars and do all of the parallel bars and all that sort of stuff, and yeah, fit as a fiddle.
I love that. And I also think that and you've obviously got to be careful, because as a teacher, you can't necessarily go in and play 11-a-side football against the kids. But I always remember when we do that safely as teachers, and you see teachers and students playing, whether it's a bit of sport or they're just, just running around, it changes. Everyone smiles, don't they? It's simple. You don't have to make it complicated. I've done talks where I've just stopped, said, get up, start moving. And people start smiling, whether they're doing the movement properly or not. When they're up and they're moving, they start smiling. So Sophie's giving us little nudges. We've got some time left. This is my last question on academic achievement. And I know your focus and your passion has been on the early years. I spent a lot of my time, especially this time of year, post mock exams, starting to get towards the back end of GCSEs, where they've got to start thinking about prepping and revising, and also for A-levels. And I'd stand in front of year 11s and year 13s and parents, and I would say things like, don't stop playing sport, it's good for you, especially things like cricket, because obviously it can go on a long time. Have movement breaks when you're revising, it helps. Keep coming to games, especially for the older students, because obviously in the independent sector they have games afternoons, but it's always, again, that subject where they go, actually, I'm not going to do games because I don't have to and it's not important for me. Have you got any stats, or can people find stats on GCSE A-level performance increasing with movement and sport and physical activity?
I'm not sure with any great deal of validity, Jez, but many years ago we were running a project in Northamptonshire that was called Get to the Start Line. It's now called Active in Mind. The longer version is called Get Exam Fit. And what it did was it did two things. One is it said, how do you connect the body to the brain in relation to concentration, cognition, and also stress relief? And you'll know this better than I do around the release of endorphins and happy hormones and how it makes you feel, but also how it makes you think calmly and accurately. But also what we did was we used the principles of performance sport around how you handle pressure when you get to the start line. And it's the same thing we do with kids. We wind them up until the point where they have to walk into an exam hall and take part in a 3-hour exam. So the things like mindset strategies and developing your brain, through neuroplasticity, thinking about goal setting, even taking care of the physical environment around you and who you spend time with. But fundamentally, what's your exercise routine? What fuel are you putting in your body? Are you hydrating? Are you getting good sleep? And the pilot project, the children who were taking part in the Get to Start Line pilot they achieved, it was around about 49% better across all of their GCSEs than the cohort that didn't. Now, we haven't done any sort of systematic review of that research, but we have consistently shown over time that taking that approach, essentially body, mind, and environment, will impact on your mental health, will help you cope better in stressful situations, but also build strategies to enable you to be better in those sorts of environments. And through the Get Exam Fit program, which is led by athlete mentors, they have consistently performed better in their exams. Now, whether it's just because of that intervention, I can't confidently say, but there are triggers there in terms of thinking about, why have you stopped going to your sports clubs and your practices? Why are you not going out and getting your 20 minutes walk, or sticking some headphones in and maybe listening to a podcast about the subject, but you're doing it actively? There's a lot to be said for that.
It's really interesting, and thanks for sharing. And something that I don't know whether you listen to the Huberman podcast, but he's American. But I don't know. I love that side of things. I love how, backed with research and science, it's not just opinion. It's not just because I feel better when I exercise. It's hormonal. It's scientific. You will sleep better when you sleep better. You recover mentally better. You recover physically. And I also like what you're saying. I did a talk this week actually to year 11s. It was about post mock response, and often with mock exams you fail, right? Because you're not ready, and that's kind of the point of them. And I agree and disagree with it in some ways. I think it's harsh, but that's the system again. But we talked about approaching it. You have to perform on exam day. That's the system, isn't it? And if you want to do well, you've got to be ready. You've got to peak, just like sport. I had a brilliant conversation with a guy called John Tate, Chris, on one of the earlier episodes, and I don't know whether you've met or spoken to him, but he's really interesting chap as well, because he works in the state sector, and he has a background in sport and American football, and he's got a brilliant website called From the Sidelines, and it's all about hacks that you can do from a health and wellbeing perspective as well, and how you can really perform academically and still kind of factor in the pillars of health and wellbeing that we've talked about. So He's a really interesting chap. Look him up. He's a really good speaker. I think
can I just say, Jez, just on that point you've made there about, because I do think that's one of the problems we've got in the UK is we look at movement in a way that's quite myopic. I'm really interested in the Canadian 24-hour movement model. I don't know if you've seen it, but they have a 24-hour movement guideline, and it breaks down 4 domains: sweat, step, sleep, and sit. In this country, we focus mainly on the sweat. And again, it's one of the barriers actually to introducing sport and physical activity into the curriculum and into school life. You know, the primary curriculum is bonkers. It's absolutely packed. So if you go, well, kids need to be moving for 60 minutes, moderate to vigorous physical activity, they go, can't do it. But it's all like the McDonald's analogy. There's no point going to McDonald's and having 3 Big Macs and then having a bottle of water, because there's absolutely no benefit in that bottle of water. It's the same if you go and run for 60 minutes. If you go and run now after this webinar and then spend the rest of tomorrow sat down, you've reaped no benefit from that exercise. So the 24-hour movement guideline says you need to shift time into different domains from, good sleep, so you have the energy to move, but then moving from sit to step, and then of course some of it will be sweat. But that step is really important. Is just getting up, moving is better than being sedentary and sitting down, not just for our bodies, but also for our brains. So yeah, it doesn't have to be rocket science. It just has to be, can we instill some movement in ourselves and in the kids around us? Because the benefits health-wise and cognitively is significant.
And that's a really good point, because I think sometimes people like to compartmentalize movement and exercise into, I've got to get my PE kit on or my sports kit and the trainers, and I'm going to sweat, and then I need a shower in a school environment in a packed. That's difficult, isn't it? And even promoting this webinar, I had a couple of comments like, I can see why kids don't want to do that. They don't want to get all sweaty, and then they've got to have a shower, but they don't want to have a shower at school. So yeah, trying to remove those barriers, and that's interesting, isn't it? And there's a big push in the PT world for adults where you can actually really improve your overall health and fitness by walking. You don't have to be out running 10Ks in under 40 minutes. Great if you want to do that, but yeah, you're right. It's just getting your body moving, and I think sometimes it's the confidence. I remember when I first did my my teacher training in Reading, and we did a session for primary teachers. My wife's a primary teacher, and I think sometimes teachers who aren't PE teachers might not have the confidence in getting kids up and moving because they're worried they might get injured, or they're worried they might get it wrong. Just like I would be worried if I was going to go into a science lab and, burn someone with a Bunsen burner, I suppose, which is totally normal. But yeah, I suppose what you're saying is, if you've got the opportunity to get out and about and out of the classroom, depending on what environment you've got and how you can do it, then that's okay. It doesn't have to be HIIT training with all the parents and all the teachers at once. It doesn't have to be some big marathon event. It can just be simple opportunities to get out of their seats and get kids moving a bit more.
We did a great piece of work with Exeter University.
By the way, probably the best university in the world.
Well, you said that, I didn't. But yeah, we worked. No, I didn't actually.
Oh, didn't? Okay.
We basically what they were coming out and saying, and there's some great research in that part of the world around, actually 10 minutes is enough. If you do sort of 10 minutes and then you do another 10 minutes, it doesn't have to be 60 minutes altogether, because actually it's negligible, the difference between 45 minutes and 60 minutes, or 60 minutes and 75 minutes. Sort of 60 minutes is sort of almost like a sort of an optimum figure for maintaining good health. So what we started to do is to layer it in the school day and say, well, okay, do as a 5-minute burst, really intensive, and that might be a bit of a break in between a lesson or during a lesson, then give us another 10 minutes. And that might be just moderate and just getting slightly out of breath. But then do another 15 minutes of general movement and stepping out, walking, whatever it may be. Just a really, really simple way of just structuring little blocks of time into the day and creating a bit of a movement culture. So you're right, it's really difficult to carve out an hour for this and half an hour for that. But this is generally, I think, about making sure there's added benefit from moving on top of having some form of intensive activity.
Chris, we're coming into the last few minutes. There's something I wanted to ask you, and again, I imagine we'll have to be very brief, and it'll be something we could talk for another hour about. You've talked a bit about boys. Is there very obvious data and evidence to suggest that there's a gender difference and that boys need those movement breaks and the movement more than girls, or is it what's the data and the feedback coming through on the differences in gender?
Yeah, again, if people want to go onto the website, there's a whole evidence review there, Jez. Look for Boys Move on the Youth Sport Trust website. The biggest problem that you've got in boys today is they have a high proportion of behavioural disorders. So they are more likely to be unregulated emotionally and blow up and be sort of disruptive either in their classroom or in their school environment than girls, and therefore they need that physical domain much more. And again, anecdotal, but we did a little bit of research around the lack of team sports during COVID. So team sports stopped for girls and boys, but boys' mental health declined the quickest during that period. And I believe there's something in relation to their access to both the outdoors, those social environments, but to the fact that team sports, which was their main outlet physically, wasn't there to support them.
That's really interesting. Chris, we're going to start wrapping this up now. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about, or any other spaces? We've obviously put the banners at the bottom for the Well Schools website. Is there anything else that we haven't touched on that you wanted to talk about and promote?
I suppose the other one was I was a bit starstruck a couple of weeks ago, Jez. We were fortunate enough to go to the Houses of Parliament to launch our manifesto, and we were also really fortunate enough to bring on Mo Farah, Sir Mo Farah, as our school sport champion. So Mo's mission, he said, you're not going to get the Mobot until the mission's complete, and it's 60 minutes a day of PE sport and play. I just urge everybody to get behind Mo's mission. You can find more details again on our website, but it's one of those things that we need to galvanize ourselves and our sector, unify our voices and go at this together. This isn't about the Youth Sport Trust, really. It's not even about Well Schools. It's about the power of us collectively uniting our voices and taking action together and making that change for kids' childhood, because for some it's not a great place to, a great world and a great environment for them to grow up in at the moment.
Chris, thank you so much for giving up your time to talk about the amazing work that you're doing with the Well Schools and wider. Sophie has put the website quite a few times on the banner, but if you do Google Well Schools or go on the Youth Sports Trust website, you can search for Well Schools and it gives you all the information. Like Chris has said, there's case studies and there's research reports that I looked at today, and it's really, really interesting stuff. And ultimately, it is really meaningful, important work that Chris and the team at the Youth Sports Trust and Well Schools Network are doing, and we really appreciate the work that you're doing. And it's fantastic to talk to you and just get an insight into some of the projects that you've been working on. Chris, thank you so much for giving up your time. Like I say, please do go on those websites and have a look. And also, if you want to see the work that we're doing, go to youhq.co.uk, and you can also look us up at YouHQ for Schools and all the social media platforms. Is there a social media site specifically, Chris, for the Well Schools Network?
Yes, at well_schools.
Brilliant.
And if people want to reach out to me, I'm at Chris Wright Well.
Chris, thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to talking to you again soon. Have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, Jez. Appreciate it.
Take care, Chris.